The Global Space Technology Convention and Exhibition is underway in Singapore, bringing together players from both the space and non-space sectors. As space becomes more interconnected and strategically important across national security, business, and technology, the focus here is on turning innovation into real economic value. And joining me is someone uniquely placed to talk about what comes next. Now, General Clinton Crosier helped build America's Space Force from the ground up, led Amazon's aerospace and satellite business, and now the president of Delta V Strategies. Thank you so much for joining me, General.
Good morning, Julie, and thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Space used to be seen mainly as commercial or scientific, but now it's increasingly talked about as a war-fighting domain. Just how serious is that shift, and is the private sector prepared for what that means?
Well, there are certainly threats to our on-orbit space capabilities. There's no question about that. And that's the biggest reason why the U.S. chose to establish the U.S. Space Force, and I had a role in that, as you said, and other allied nations have followed suit. But I think the larger, more important opportunity to think about really is how do you translate all that critical space capability into commercial value? And as you said, that's the goal of the convention and the exhibition here this week. It's really about identifying that commercial value. And as an example, Deloitte and SST, the Singapore Space and Technology think tank, have estimated that Earth observation imagery alone could bring as much as $100 billion US dollars in new GDP across Southeast Asia by 2030. And more broadly across Asia, that could be as large as 600 billion US dollars in additional GDP. So while the threats are there, the opportunity is extraordinary. And frankly, the new challenge in space is not necessarily just innovation and invention, although that's certainly part of it today, but it's translating those capabilities into economic growth. And as we said, there's an economic growth engine out there just waiting to be harnessed.
Okay, so, I understand you've worked closely with space companies across Asia Pacific. Where is the real momentum right now? And is Southeast Asia moving quickly enough to stay competitive?
Well, they certainly are. And by the way, competition has to be looked at in a couple of ways. Competition doesn't necessarily have to mean competing to build more satellites and launch more rockets than other nations are doing. There certainly is competition globally there. But my message, especially for the conference here and for Southeast Asia, is that doesn't have to be where you try to win and compete. Because what we're seeing is there's an emerging new set of underlying capabilities that support all that. As we're bringing 10 times more data down from space than we ever have before over the next 10 years. And by the way, that's equivalent to nearly the entire global internet traffic in the early 2000s. So we'll be bringing as much space data down in one day as we did across the entire global internet. And so how do you secure that data, store that data, analyze that data to make sense of it and provide value for agriculture, maritime security, climate management, wildlife, city planning, all those things? That's where there are great opportunities to compete and fill the gaps as the new space economy grows.
Okay, a lot of that growth is being driven by data and connectivity. You've talked about bringing the cloud closer to the mission, even putting computing power in orbit. So how close are we from space-based data centers becoming normal?
Yeah, well, moving cloud computing technology into orbit is already happening. As you may know, a couple of years ago, even when I led the global space business at AWS, we put a cloud computing package on the International Space Station, and we demonstrated that astronauts on the space station could do 5 times more scientific experimentation by processing the data on orbit instead of having to push it through very small bandwidths down to the Earth, which sometimes could take as much as 8 to 10 hours just to get the data down, and then 8 to 10 hours to get the experimental results back again. So 5 times more if you can do that computing on orbit. Now, when people think about on-orbit data centers, obviously the first thing they think of is the giant data centers we have on the Earth today that comprise entire city blocks in some cases. And we won't be moving those to space anytime soon. But what you will see is we'll be putting more and more cloud computing packages on orbit to process the data where it is instead of having to move it. And you'll start seeing that proliferate on 10 satellites, and then 100, and then 1,000, and then 10,000 satellites. And networked and integrated, they will provide cloud-based storage, computing, analysis capabilities in orbit and beyond.
But if critical computing and, as you said, communications move into orbit, who ultimately controls the data?
Well, when I was at AWS, of course, the customer always controls the data, but whoever owns the data is who controls the data. But here's where there are great opportunities, as I said. Here across Southeast Asia, there are a number of opportunities to fill the gaps for data storage, data communications, data networking, data integration, data management, right? And so as we see all that space data proliferating and coming down, the organizations that can figure out how to harness that infrastructure are the organizations that'll win in this new space economy.
Okay, finally, we've seen this industry from almost every angle. You've seen the military, government, and now commercial business. So, General, looking ahead 10 years from now, what do you think we are still underestimating most about space, both the opportunities and the dangers?
Yeah, well, I think there will be two key things on the opportunities. On the opportunities, we'll see growing opportunities in space for space, as we might call it. That's the opportunities and activity that happens in space for space. And what you're going to see over time is we're going to start building things in space. So we'll be doing in-orbit manufacturing. We'll be doing in-orbit satellite servicing. Instead of having to deorbit a satellite when it runs out of fuel, we'll refuel satellites on orbit. Or if a satellite loses a solar array, we'll be able to fix the satellite solar array on orbit and not have to bring it back to Earth. So manufacturing, sustaining satellite capabilities. And as Artemis moves forward, and of course we were all excited when we saw the Artemis astronauts circle the moon, and Singapore, as you know, is part of the Artemis Accords. But as Artemis goes back to the moon and sets up a human encampment on the moon and then pushes off to Mars, there will be all sorts of opportunities there. And that's the Space for Space mission, as well as asteroid mining and space tourism and those kind of things. But then when we think about space for the Earth, and that's a mission that I like to call making the world a better place from space, and that's how we said that's all those opportunities to use space data to support climate management and disaster preparedness and maritime security. There's a growing opportunity to figure out how we can use space in new and innovative ways. We're using space in ways today we didn't anticipate 10 years ago. And we're using, we'll need to use space applications 10 years from now in ways that we haven't thought of yet, and that'll be key. In terms of the challenges, we have to be mindful. When you put 10 to 20 times more satellites on orbit, and as an example, there are approximately 10,000 satellites on orbit today, and most experts with this proliferation we're talking about assess that we'll have somewhere between 30 to 40 to 50,000 satellites on orbit in 10 years. So that creates some congestion, right? So the real opportunity and challenge is we have to be more diligent about space traffic management and collision avoidance. We talked a lot about sustainability of life here on Earth, but if we're going to sustain our capability to operate in space, we need improved space traffic management, collision avoidance capabilities, and they're possible. And again, it's an opportunity for companies to fill the gap and organizations to fill the gap to make sure we're providing that sustainment.
Okay, exciting times ahead, General. Thank you very much for your insight and your time this morning. We've been speaking with General Clinton Crosier, the president of Delta V Strategies.